I was born in Salem, Massachusetts. Don't read anything into that. There were no witches in Salem, Massachusetts 300 years ago. They all moved there in the 1970s. And my mother was a virgin. She just wasn't very good at it. And I was born prematurely. Actually, I was born with scoliosis. And I've had a bad back all of my life. And it was something that drained all of my energy away from me. So by the time I was a teenager, it's like I didn't want to do anything. I would just sit there in front of the TV. It was kind of like, I felt totally blah, totally depressed. I didn't understand anything. I didn't understand why I felt totally depressed. It was like, back then, when you were depressed, people would say, so what? What do you mean you're depressed? Get a job. That was the attitude back then. Nowadays, everybody's depressed. But back then, it was like, just a totally different thing. And I probably broke the record for missing the most days at school, in the history of the school. And I did have to go to school, even though I didn't want to. And I had to walk around, even though I didn't want to sometimes. And once I was walking downtown, and this was in Beverly, Massachusetts, which is right next to Salem, where I lived most of the early part of my life. And I walked into a music store, and there was this group that was coming over to America from England called the Beatles, right? And I heard this music, and I heard this guitar work by George Harrison, and it sent shivers up and down my spine, which was pretty cool because I didn't feel anything in my spine. And I knew right then what I had to do. I was going to be a guitar player. Nothing was going to stop me from being a guitar player. And I did become a guitar player, and I became a good guitar player. Not a great one, because I didn't have a lot of ambition or energy. But at least I had some musical talent, and I was able to make myself sound good. I had good taste, and I was able to, do some nice licks and everything. So that was cool. And then when it came time to graduate from high school, all I wanted to do was play my guitar. But there was this problem. There was this thing going on called the war in Vietnam. Right now, I didn't want to go to Vietnam because I'm not a fighter. I had the heart of a poet. I didn't have the heart of a warrior. And so I didn't want to go to Vietnam. And at the same time, I didn't want to go to college either because I hated school. And I've never been a big reader. And I'm not an academic or anything like that, which is why people sometimes are very surprised at the level of spiritual teachings in the Disappearance of the Universe, because they realize that I couldn't have done it. And it's like, I get to the point now where I'm going to graduate from high school, and I don't know what to do. And fortunately for me, this guy became president of the United States. His name was Richard Nixon, and I hated him. But he did one of the biggest favors for me that anybody has ever done. He switched over to this thing called the draft lottery system. And the draft lottery system is very interesting. They draw all the dates of the year in America like it's a lottery. In whatever order your birthday comes up, that's your draft lottery number. And if your birthday comes up in the top 1/3, say, from 0 to 122, you have an excellent chance of getting drafted. You're probably going to get drafted. But if you're in the middle third, like from 122 to 244, it's iffy. Maybe, maybe not. But if you're in that bottom third, from 244 to 366, you got like no chance of being drafted. So I'm praying the old-fashioned way to Jesus. I'm saying, please, please, have my lottery number come up near 300 so I don't have to worry about going to Vietnam or going to college. They had the lottery drawing for my year, and my number came out 296, right? So all of a sudden, I was free. I didn't have to worry about going to Vietnam. I didn't have to worry about going to college. I could just play my guitar for the rest of my life and live, happily ever after and all that, right? Well, that's not the way that things work in this world. The way that things work in this world is if you solve one problem out there on the screen, then what you get is another problem. And the whole purpose of it is to keep your mind distracted, to keep it out there on the screen where the answer is not, instead of focusing on the projector, which is where the answer really is. So the next problem that I came up with at that time was that I started to drink. And I started to drink a lot. Then I started to drink some more. Then I started to smoke a lot of grass. And that pretty much covers the 1970s. And, I knew that I wasn't being a good person, and I felt guilty about that, which the ego loves. The ego wants you to feel guilty. And I felt bad because both my parents died when I was in my 20s. And I felt guilty about some of the things that I'd said to them because they were wonderful people, beautiful people. and I had said things to them that I regretted, and I felt terrible about it, and that didn't help me at all. And eventually I decided that I was going to find some way to deal with this problem of drinking too much. So I decided one of the ways I was going to deal with it was I was going to become a born-again Christian. So I did. I became a born-again Christian. And that wore off after a little while. And then I tried it again. I was actually born again a couple of times in the late 1970s. And the good thing about that was that I read the Bible. Now, when I read the Bible, it was actually very interesting, because it would say things that I could agree with. Like, it would say that God is love. And that made sense to me. At one point, the Bible says that God is perfect love. That made perfect sense to me. The only problem is I would look someplace else in the Bible, and he's like a killer. And he's wrathful, and he's vengeful, and he's getting even with people and stuff. And I'm thinking, wait a minute here. How can God be perfect love over here and be this wrathful, vengeful creature over here? It's like it always depends on what kind of a mood he's in or something. And that struck me as being very human. And because of that, I had a very difficult time with organized religion. And I couldn't really stick with organized religion. But it was also very interesting when I read the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. There was something about those words that struck me as being true. They rang true for me, but it was more than that. I felt like I knew him. I felt like he was my friend. I felt like I could talk to him in my mind, and he would help me. I couldn't quite put my finger on why I felt that way, but I never gave up on this relationship that I felt with Jesus. I always felt like he was my friend. I couldn't stick with organized religion, but I couldn't give up my relationship with Jesus. And it wasn't a religious thing. I like to say that, in the winter I'm a Buddhist, in the summer I'm a nudist. It's like, it's not a religious thing for me, but I did feel like he was my friend, and I would talk to him in my mind, and that never stopped. That continues to this very day. So I went back to drinking, and I drank with Jesus, and as I went along, I was still looking for some way to straighten out my life. And fortunately for me, this thing came over to the East Coast in America from the West Coast called the EST training. And I did this thing called the EST training, and it was actually my introduction to this idea of being a cause instead of effect. And when that happened, it was such a powerful idea for me personally. It went into my unconscious mind, and I literally changed my life in the next few years. And that was also when I had what I would describe as my first mystical type experience. My mystical experiences have always been very visual. They've always been something that was, very visual, and I could see. I'm not too audible. I think I've had one or two great audible experiences, but mostly they've been visual. And when I did the S training, they had us get up on the stage and look out at the audience. And I looked out at the audience and the people in the back of the room who were helping with the training, and it looked like everybody was moving in slow motion. And it was almost like I could see the individual frames of a movie. And when you have a mystical experience, first of all, they usually be very brief. Secondly, you have some kind of an intuition, like you know what it means. You're being told by the Holy Spirit what it means. And even though I didn't think about the Holy Spirit back then, I can look back on it and see that the Holy Spirit is working with everybody all the time, including me back then. And the experience that I had with that was that I was the one who was doing that. Time was not something that was being done to me. It was being done by me. And great spiritual masters like Jesus and Buddha realized that the world is not being done to them. It's being done by them. It's not coming at them. It's coming from them. It's a total reversal of the way that the world traditionally thinks. Yet it's the truth. And that was my first experience. Not just an idea, but an experience of being a cause instead of effect. And just the idea, had enormous implications for me. I no longer felt like a victim. And there's a great workbook lesson in A Course in Miracles that says, I am not a victim of the world I see. And that's an idea that Est would have been very much in harmony with. And it changed my life at that time. It was my introduction to spirituality, real spirituality, and I kept searching and learning a lot of things, and I totally changed. I went from being a musician who hardly ever worked to being a musician who worked all the time. I would play like 5-6 nights a week, twice a day on weekends. I would work hard, and I started making money. I felt good. My relatives didn't think I was a jerk anymore, so it was fun. And I met this woman named Karen, and she was my type, female, and we hit it off, and we got married, and we eventually went on to become each other's best forgiveness lesson. Because we didn't always get along, and right at this time, I'm going through a very difficult divorce, and it's not fun. But at the same time, I thank God for my teachers, because they explained to me in the second book how a successful relationship is a relationship where you are forgiving the other person, or have forgiven the other person. That's their definition of a successful relationship. Most people think that a successful relationship is a relationship where it works out there on the screen, and everything looks good, and you live happily ever after. But according to my teachers, no, that doesn't matter. What matters is whether or not you're using it for the Holy Spirit's purposes, which is forgiveness. So now we can just do that, and we don't have to worry about what people think. I mean, if they were so smart, they wouldn't be here. So we don't have to worry about the opinions of others. We can just forgive as we go along and realize that that's what the Holy Spirit wants us to do with it. So I went along for a few years, and all of a sudden I was having great experiences. The 1980s, I made up for the 1970s. I lived 2 decades in the 1980s. I was doing all kinds of things. I was walking on hot coals. I was riding in hot air balloons. I jumped out of an airplane with a parachute. And it was like, a lot of fun for a while. But then after 7 years or so, I started to realize that this wasn't making me happy either. And that was a dilemma, because not doing anything, that didn't make me happy. Now doing everything, that wasn't making me happy either. So I had a problem. And I decided then that I was going to change my life again. And so I decided that I was going to move someplace quiet and peaceful. And that I was going to examine my life and figure out what I really wanted to do with my life. And it took me over 2 years to get out of the band that I was in, because I had my signature on a lot of contracts. But by the beginning of 1990, I moved to Maine. Now, Maine is not that far from Massachusetts, but it's totally different than Massachusetts. It's 90% wooded. It's the most heavily wooded state in America. It's quiet. It's peaceful. It has clean air, clean water, a low crime rate. Very peaceful place. Very nice place. I got up there, and I had some vague idea about supporting myself, with a business. And I got up there into Bowling Spring, Maine, and there were no people. There were no sidewalks. And maybe I should have done more research, but the business plan didn't go too good. But what did go good was that I got very good at meditating. And I had experimented with meditation in the 1980s. And I had a nice quiet environment. We didn't have any children, and I've never had any children. And I did have a dog that barked a lot, but aside from that, it was a very quiet, environment. And when I got up there, I found that I got very good at meditation. I got to the point where I felt like I could achieve absolute stillness. And that's what the Tao is absolute stillness. The reason that it's absolute stillness is because, as we said, it doesn't change. Because if it was changing, it would be evolving, and if it would be evolving, it wouldn't be perfect. And the Tao is perfect. Just as God is perfect, just as whatever you want to call it, is perfect. And when I started to get in touch with that absolute stillness, I also felt like I was getting in touch with a deeper part of the mind. The part of the mind that's underneath the surface. People think that their conscious mind is so important, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. The conscious mind is the part of that mind that sticks out, above the surface. But almost all of the iceberg is underneath the surface, and that's what the mind is like. Almost all of it is hidden from us. And that's what runs us. It's not the part of the mind that we can see that runs us. It's the part of the mind that we can't see that is running us. And that's where the projector is also. And that's why we have to find a way to alter that which is in our own unconscious mind. And I felt like I was getting in touch with the unconscious mind, and it was exciting to me. I didn't really understand it, but it felt big. It felt like I was getting in touch with something big. And in the meantime, my personal life was going to hell. I hated Maine. The people there hated me. I couldn't make any money. I couldn't make anything work. I had a terrible relationship with my in-laws. My wife was threatening to leave me. But the meditation was going really good. And so, I was doing this meditation. I'd been up there for almost 3 years at the end of 1992. And that's when I was sitting in my living room meditating. I opened my eyes and I looked over at my living room couch and I saw these 2 people sitting there, and they started to instruct me. Now, just before that, it's about 2 months before that, I was doing so badly that I figured I've got to go back to playing my guitar. You know, I've got to go back to playing my guitar because that's the only thing I'm good at. It's the only thing I make money at. So I took my guitar out of my closet. I started practicing in my living room. I'm playing the guitar, and all of a sudden I felt like a hand start pushing down the guitar while I was playing it. And I'm trying to play the guitar, and this hand is pushing down the guitar, and me along with it, you know, going all the way down while I'm trying to play. And I got the message. And the message was, no, that's not what you're supposed to do anymore. There's something else that you're supposed to do. And I didn't know what it was, but 2 months later, I found out. And that was the day that Art and Persa appeared to me, and my life would never be the same. I was in Poland Spring, Maine, and I was meditating, and I was in my living room, and I came out of my meditation, and I looked over at my living room couch, and there were two people sitting there on my living room couch. There was like this beautiful, wonderful, amazing, drop-dead gorgeous woman was sitting there, and some guy. I didn't care too much about him. And she started to talk to me, and I started to talk back to her. Now, of course, people say, you know, why don't you go running out of the room screaming when these two people showed up on your living room couch? And I think part of the reason for it is because if you could see the look on their faces, you know, they were just so peaceful. And that reassured me a great deal. It's like there was nothing there to be worried about, you know, nothing to be threatened about. They were very peaceful looking. The tone of their voice was very non-threatening. And so I was interested. And looking back on it, you know, 14 years later, I can see that the reason that they appeared to me as people was because they wanted the conversations that we would have to be human. They wanted it to be the kind of thing that were like, you know, right in my face. Because a lot of the spiritual teachings that we get are channeled. They seem to come from up above somewhere. And because of that, they're a little bit removed from our experience. And Art and Persa, as they came to call themselves, they were like so blunt and so clear with me, and so much within my everyday experience, and talking to me in my language and on my level, that it was like I couldn't get away from what they were saying. And what they did eventually was they explained to me this very long spiritual document called A Course in Miracles, which has around 1,300 pages. And they told me after the second visit that I was going to start studying this thing called A Course in Miracles. Of course, my attitude was, well, you know, nobody's going to tell me what to do. But there I was 3 days later buying my first copy of A Course in Miracles, and I picked it up and I started to read it. It might as well have been written in a foreign language. I mean, you know, it didn't make very much sense to me. I had read the Bible, so I could see in certain places that the voice of A Course in Miracles was speaking in the first person and claiming to be Jesus. I don't know how I felt about that at first. I think I thought that it better be really good, or else I'll expose it as a fraud or a hoax or something. But it turned out that it was very good. The only problem was I couldn't understand it. Yet, after Art and Persa had been visiting me for about 6 months to a year, I would go back and read A Course in Miracles, and it made total sense to me. So I could see what they were doing. They were taking this very difficult spiritual document and giving me information in such a way that I could go back, read it for myself, and everything would just jump off the page at me. It was very clear. And I thought, wow, you know, if they're doing that for me, maybe they could do the same thing for other people. And it has turned out that way. The woman, Persa, claimed to be the recorder of the Gospel of Thomas. For those who don't know, the Gospel of Thomas is the first gospel that was ever written. And it was destroyed by the church. It disappeared from the face of the earth for like 1,600 years. And fortunately, somebody buried a copy of it in a place in Egypt called Nag Hammadi, and it was dug up in 1945. And at first the church said, oh, you know, that's a forgery, you can't pay any attention to it. But what happened was the biblical scholars, you know, eventually translated it, and it got to be studied. And they came to a somewhat different conclusion than the church. Their conclusion was that these things were the kinds of things that Jesus may have actually said at that time and place. The first Gospels that were written were called sayings Gospels because they were just a listing of things that Jesus said. There were no stories in them. The stories came later, much later. And what we think of today as the mainstream Gospels look very much like they were written. You know, they look a lot like novels, where the Gospel of Thomas doesn't look that way. It has sayings that are almost like Zen koans. They're very esoteric, very interesting. And they reveal a wisdom teacher, someone who is not claiming to be, God's only begotten Son, not presenting himself as being anybody special. He was simply saying, look, if you do what I do, if you follow my example, then you can be like me. You can have the same incredible experience of your perfect oneness with God that I'm having if you do, what I do. So he was really leading by example. And you can clearly see that in the Gospel of Thomas. He's not claiming that heaven is an outside, thing that's going to be brought to you by somebody through some kind of magical, vicarious salvation. But rather he's teaching that if you look at the world in a certain way and practice a certain kind of forgiveness, then you will become like him. The way he puts it in the Gospel of Thomas, he says, whoever drinks from my mouth shall become like me, and I myself will become that person. And we will live as a single one. So he's actually saying that he will join with you and become one with you, because spirit is something that is our reality, and he's teaching us how to attain that reality and actually experience it. Forgiveness is vital to the message of the Disappearance of the Universe, my second book, Your Immortal Reality, because forgiveness is the central theme in A Course in Miracles. But this isn't the way that most people think about forgiveness. There are two ideas in A Course in Miracles. One has to do with spirit, and what you really are. The other has to do with forgiveness. And the ideas of those two things, as expressed in A Course in Miracles, is different than the way that the world traditionally thinks about them. For example, people think of the idea of spirit as being like an individual thing, like you have an individual soul. So if I die, there's a part of me that goes on after me, and this thing that goes on after me looks suspiciously like the body that I just occupied. It's really a separation idea. It's an idea of individual existence, individual identity, where spirit in A Course in Miracles would be synonymous with God, synonymous with heaven, which the Course teaches is the awareness of perfect oneness. So you have this awareness of perfect oneness. That's what we really are. And because it's perfect oneness, there would be no individual identity. There would be no separation or division within it. It would be flawless. It would be perfect. It would be whole. It would be full. You see Jesus using the word wholeness in the Gospel of Thomas. And the word holy actually comes from the word whole. And he says, I'm the one who comes from what is whole. I was given from the things of my Father. Therefore I say, if one is whole, one will be filled with light. But if one is divided, then one will be filled with darkness. And what he's saying there is that you have to be whole, and you can't be a little bit whole. You're either completely whole or you're not. And so your allegiance must be undivided. So the allegiance is to a kind of spirit that is perfect oneness. It has no separation within it. And the experience of that is brought about by the kind of forgiveness that is taught in the Course. It's forgiveness that leads to the experience of what you really are. And experience is very important, because experience is the only thing that will ever make you happy. Words won't do it. Theology won't do it. My words won't do it. But what will do it is an experience of what you really are and where you really are. And that's the experience that A Course in Miracles is directed toward. At one point, Jesus in the Course is talking about all these questions that we have. They're very difficult questions. Like somebody will ask, how did I get here? And I'll say, well, according to A Course in Miracles, you're not here. And they'll say, well, yeah, I know, but how did I get here? And it's a circular thing. And in the workbook of A Course in Miracles, Jesus says, the ego will ask many questions this Course does not answer. For example, how did the impossible occur? The impossible being the idea that we could be separate from our source, be separate from God. Then he says something very interesting. He says, there is no answer, only an experience. Seek only this, and do not let theology delay you. And what he's saying there is that the answer to all of our questions that will really satisfy us will come in the form of an experience of what we really are, which is this perfect spirit, which is really no different than God, and where we really are, which is actually heaven, as opposed to this dream that we're having, which we will awaken from, which is a dream of time and space, a dream of separation and division and form, and all kinds of things that can't possibly exist in perfect oneness. And so the kind of forgiveness that leads to that would also be in harmony with the idea of oneness. It would be more in harmony with the new physics rather than the old physics. In the old physics, Newtonian physics, you have separation. You have a subject and an object. You know, things are separate from each other. You have consciousness. For consciousness, you have to have more than one thing. You have to have something else to be conscious of. So it's kind of like you have something that is a little different than perfect oneness. In perfect oneness, there is more like an awareness than a consciousness, because it's the awareness of all of it, of being everything, rather than this separation state that we appear to be in right now. So the kind of forgiveness that we're talking about would be a forgiveness that recognizes the oneness of all things, even in the illusion. And with that way of thinking, you would be forgiving yourself at the same time that you're forgiving somebody else, because if we're perfect oneness and everything is connected, which the new physics confirms, when you get down to the subatomic level, everything is connected, everything is whole. You can't really separate one thing from anything else. So under that way of thinking, to forgive somebody else is actually to forgive yourself, because everything is one and everything is connected. Events in a dream do appear to happen. They do look like they're happening. And you can feel them, you can experience them, even in the dreams that you have in bed at night. You know, let's take a hypothetical scenario. Let's say you have a 3-year-old daughter. She's in bed at night and she's dreaming. You peek in on her. You can see that she's having this bad dream because she's tossing and she's turning. You can tell it's not a very comfortable dream. Now, what do? You don't go over there and shake the hell out of her, right? Because that might scare her. You don't want to scare her. You want her to be happy. You want her to wake up in a peaceful way. So instead, maybe you'll whisper to her. Maybe you'll say things to her like, hey, it's only a dream. You know, you don't have to worry. What you're seeing is not true. In fact, you made it up. It's in your mind. And when you think about it, when she's having this dream, what is she seeing these events in the dream with? Her eyes are closed. She's actually seeing it with her mind. Well, that's actually what we're seeing this with right now, is with our mind. It's a projection that's coming from our unconscious mind, which is coming from us. We think the world is being done to us. No. The world is being done by us. It's not coming at us, and we're not victims of it. It's coming from us, and we made it. And we made that which we are perceiving. And in the dream, for all intents and purposes, your 3-year-old daughter is experiencing this dream as if it is reality. You know, that dream has become her reality. And where she really is, which is safe at home in the bed, is out of her awareness. It doesn't mean that it's not there, but it's out of her awareness. She's still there, safe at home in the bed, but she can't see it. Now, you can't see her dream. Why? Because it doesn't exist. It's not real. But you talk to her and you comfort her, and she can hear your voice in the dream. Because the truth can be heard in the dream. The truth is not in the dream, ever. If you just remember that one thing, you'll save yourself a lot of time. The truth is not in the dream, ever. But the truth can be heard in the dream. And here you are now talking to her, and she starts listening to your voice instead of the voice that speaks about the reality of the dream. Because you're saying, you know, hey, you made it up. What you're seeing is not true. You can relax. You know, all these things that you think are so important in that dream and so heavy, well, they're nothing. They're coming from you. You know, and she starts to hear your voice and listen to your voice, and she starts to relax, and she starts to feel better. And then eventually she wakes up. And she wakes up and she's not frightened, and she's happy. In fact, as she was going along, the dream became a happier dream. Why? Because she was listening to your voice. She was listening to the right voice instead of the wrong voice. But that happiness was not dependent on what was going on in the dream. And if your happiness in this dream that we call the world, if your happiness is dependent on what's going on in the dream, you're in trouble. Because the only thing that you can count on in this dream is that it's going to change. You know, it's a dream of shift and change. It's what the Buddhists call impermanence. What the Hindus call the world of multiplicity. You know, all it's going to do is change. And if it's bad, it's going to go good. That's nice. The only problem is then it's going to go bad again. Because that's what this world does. You know, it's not a form of constancy like you have in reality. So when we woke up this morning from the dreams that we had in bed last night, all we woke up to was a different form of dreaming. And the reason that it seems so much more real than the dreams that we had in bed last night is a function of levels, which do not exist in reality. You know, there are no shifts and changes in reality because it's perfect stillness, like the Tao, which is absolute stillness. The reason for that is because if something is moving or changing, then it's evolving. And if something is evolving, then it's not perfect. If it was perfect, then it wouldn't have to evolve. So it's like you have this dream going on that seems very real, and the Holy Spirit is whispering exactly the same kinds of things to us in this dream that we would whisper to a 3-year-old who's having a dream in bed at night. The Holy Spirit right now is saying to us, hey, it's only a dream. You don't have to worry. What you're seeing is not true. In fact, you made it up. It's coming from you, and you're viewing it with your mind. As the Course in Miracles says, you're reviewing mentally that which has already gone by. And so it's like you're viewing this with the mind, and the Holy Spirit is saying, hey, it's no big deal. You don't have to worry. And if we start to listen to the right voice instead of the wrong voice, then it changes the nature of our dream. Maybe it becomes a happier dream. But that happiness is not dependent on what appears to be going on in the dream, because we're being taught a certain kind of forgiveness by the Holy Spirit that starts to break the spell, that starts to loosen our experience of being bodies and being in the world, and starts to shift our experience to the idea of being what we really are, which is this perfect and immortal spirit. And then as we listen to the right voice and practice forgiveness, as we go along, the dream becomes a happier dream, and then eventually we wake up. And when we wake up, then we're just like the 3-year-old who is surprised to find out that she never left the bed, that she was there all along. It was just out of, our awareness. Where we really are, what we awaken to is heaven. But this heaven is not being brought to us by an outside force. It's not something removed from us. It's actually within us. And we are everywhere and everything, and so heaven is contained within us. A Course in Miracles says you are at home in God, dreaming of exile, but perfectly capable of awakening to reality. Well, what we awaken to is reality. 2,000 years ago in the Gospel of Thomas, the disciples went to Jesus and said, when will the kingdom come? And he said, it will not come by watching for it. It will not be said, behold here or behold there. Rather, the kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and people do not see it. Just like the 3-year-old couldn't see the bed while she was in her dream, we cannot see heaven in our dream, because we're dreaming of an unreality. But when we awaken, as great masters like Buddha and Jesus did, as Buddha said, I am awake. When we awaken, then we see reality. Then we see the kingdom of heaven, which was actually there all along, but it was out of our awareness. It doesn't mean that it wasn't there, but we had this dream. And events in a dream do appear to happen. And you will appear to hurt yourself and feel pain if you do something to yourself in this dream that causes that. But at the same time, even the idea of pain will dissipate if you listen to the right voice, and you will get to the point where your body becomes very much like the figure in a dream that it actually is. And you even get to the point where you cannot feel pain and cannot be hurt in terms of pain or suffering. So even on the way, it's a better way of life than experiencing the dream as if it were real. Because if the dream is real, it can hurt. But through a certain kind of forgiveness, you can get to the point where it doesn't hurt, and where you can actually begin to experience your reality as spirit instead of the false experience of being a body. According to my teachers in the book, as it turned out, we knew each other better than I suspected. It turned out that I was one of them in a previous incarnation and also in a future incarnation. So when I use the term incarnation, I want to make sure people understand that that's just a dream too. We never actually go into a body. We're not really in body. We just think we are. And if the world is a projection, which it is, that is coming from the unconscious mind, then you have to look at it this way. People who've read my books, they know that I like to go to the movies. It's my favorite hobby. I go to the movies. I get into the movie, the lights go down, my attention is distracted to the screen. So I start paying attention to the screen, and I want it to be real. That's why it's fun, because I forget that it's not real. I get into the story. I may even start to react to the screen, talk to the screen, say, no, don't go there. It's like the screen becomes the reality, and I forget that there's not really anything happening on the screen. It's just a projection. And if I really wanted to have a lasting impact on what's on that screen, it's not going to do me too much good to go up and fool around with the screen. what I would have to do is I would have to find the projector. You know, there's a projector hidden in the back, and I'm not supposed to think about that. I'm supposed to forget about that. That's what we've done with this movie that we call our life. You know, we've completely forgotten about the projector. It's unconscious to us because it's literally in our unconscious mind. And we're viewing this movie, and if we really want to have a real and lasting impact on what's on the screen, it doesn't do us a hell of a lot of good to be fooling around with the screen. Fooling around with the screen, which is what most spiritualities do nowadays, they get people focusing out there on the screen, and so now, you know, now I'm going to focus on, you know, getting my Mercedes and getting my mansion and, you know, getting all this wealth and abundance. People think that abundance is spiritual, you know, and it's all cyclical. It's like, you know, 150 years ago, being spiritual would have meant that you didn't have anything, you know, and no possessions. You know, so it's like, you know, people just make it up as they go along. Oh, now it's spiritual to have $1 billion. Where 150 years ago, it was spiritual to have nothing. You know, and it's like as if they believe that getting what they want is going to make them happy. You know, when it's always been demonstrated that people get what they want and they're not happy. And I know, I've met billionaires who aren't happy. You know, so that's not going to make them happy. But people are making that into spirituality nowadays. And I know, you know, just between you and I know that the secret doesn't work and the law of attraction doesn't work. I'll tell you why. For the last 2 years, I've been focusing on Shakira, right? Where is she? Yeah? So it's like, you know, I know that that doesn't work. But actually, that thing, you know, like the law of attraction, the secret, that was done much better by Napoleon Hill. There's a great book by Napoleon Hill called Think and Grow Rich, where you can see the secret the way it was meant to be taught. And what they do nowadays is all you have to do is focus on these things and think about these things. The law of attraction, you'll attract it into your life, whatever you're thinking about. And that's true to a certain extent, but they leave out the most important parts. You know, they'll say, oh, Da Vinci used the secret, or Thomas Edison used the secret. But what they won't tell you is that those guys worked their butts off. I mean, they work 16 hours a day, 20 hours a day. And now people today think, oh, I can just skip that part. No. They not only came up with a solid plan on how to do things and had this intense desire to attract them into their lives, they also did the work that was necessary to make it happen. And if you don't do the work that's necessary to make it happen, it's probably not going to happen. Yeah, maybe for 1 out of 100 people. Then you can put that one person on television and they can talk about how this worked for them. But what about the other 99 people, you know, out of 100? And real spirituality like Buddhism or A Course in Miracles, is not about fixing up the screen. That's why A Course in Miracles says this is a course in cause and not effect. There's nothing happening on the screen, not really, but there is this projector. And if you really want to get out of here and go home, which is the goal of real spirituality, then what you got to do is you got to find that projector and you've got to change what's in the projector. And the way that you do that is through mental discipline and a certain kind of forgiveness that undoes the dream, that undoes the projection and returns you to reality. And that's the kind of spirituality that my books are about and that A Course in Miracles is all about. Good spirituality, good classic spirituality, focuses on undoing the dream or undoing, you know, what we see as, you know, the illusion, as the Hindus and the Buddhists have always called it. And the way that it's done in A Course in Miracles is kind of like an accelerated way of doing things. There's a very important law of the mind that is set forth in A Course in Miracles. That law of the mind is this. It says, as you see him, you will see yourself. There's a very good reason for that. There's a teaching in Buddhism that teaches that there is just one ego appearing as many. Now, we mentioned that the Hindus call it the world of multiplicity. You can look out and see trillions of different pieces of things out there that are all seemingly separate. The Buddhists would say that you have one ego appearing as many, and you're it. You know, it's not somebody else. There's just one ego, and you're it. And, you know, once you understand that, then you can start to understand the concept like, as you see him, you will see yourself. Because if there's really just one of us that's here, and let's assume for now that the unconscious mind knows that. You know, there are people who study the unconscious mind who will tell you that the unconscious mind is aware of everything, that the unconscious mind knows every single piece of information that is available to the entire universe of time and space. So let's assume that the unconscious mind knows that there's really only one of us here and that you're it. If that's true, then what are you doing if you go through life judging and condemning other people? All that you're really doing is judging and condemning yourself. But it doesn't look that way. It's a trick. Albert Einstein described a person's experience as kind of like an optical delusion of consciousness. Because he understood as a physicist that we think that we're confined to this tiny little speck of time and space. But a physicist would tell you that you're actually a non-spatial being having a spatial experience. What that means is that it looks like you're just here in this tiny little speck of time and space, when the truth is you're actually everywhere, in every time, and you're unlimited. And once you start to understand that, then you can say, wait a minute, the Buddhists were right. The Buddhists said that to judge another person is like drinking poison and then waiting for somebody else to die. That's about how much sense it makes to judge and condemn another person, because you're really just judging and condemning yourself. There isn't really anybody out there for it to go to. It's just going directly into your own unconscious mind as a message from you, to you, and about you. So let's say that I'm driving down the street, or I'm driving down the highway in America, and somebody, cuts me off in traffic, and I go, that son of a bitch. Well, I just called myself a son of a bitch. Because there isn't really anybody out there for it to go to. And once people start to understand that very deep and fundamental law of the mind, then I would think that they would want to get pretty damn careful about the way that they think about other people. Because all that they're really doing is sending a message to themselves. And people, they wonder why they're depressed. I mean, God, look at the garbage that they've been putting out there for their whole lives. So it really is a very powerful concept. It's a step beyond Buddha's work. Buddha undid his ego through total non-judgment. And that's possible. That can be done. A Course in Miracles would agree that it could be done. In fact, at one point, A Course in Miracles says that the ego cannot survive without judgment. So if you simply took away judgment, and I'm not saying that would be easy, but if you actually took away all judgment, your ego could not survive. And spirituality, like Buddhism and A Course in Miracles, is about the undoing of the ego. The way that A Course in Miracles puts it in its introduction, it says, "This course does not aim to teach the meaning of love, for that is beyond what can be taught. It does aim, however, at removing the blocks to the awareness of love's presence, which is your natural inheritance." It's that kingdom of heaven that Jesus was talking about in the Gospel of Thomas. And his message hasn't changed in the last 2,000 years. It's always remained the same. Other people have changed it, but he never changed it. And it still remains the same. And when you undo that ego, when you undo the false you, then the real you will be all that's left. And that real you is spirit. But once again, this is a spirit that is all-encompassing. It's perfect oneness. It's immortal and invulnerable and fearless. And it's a great experience. And that experience of being spirit can be had even when we appear to be here in this dream and think that we're a body. We can still have the experience of what it's like to be with God in heaven. And that experience is best facilitated by changing the way that you look at other people. If you add a dimension to it like Jesus did, and actually change the way that you see people from seeing them, or more accurately thinking of them as being bodies, and switch over to thinking of them as being what they really are, which is this immortal spirit, then that is how you will come to see yourself. You can't help but have that happen. If it's true that as you see him, you will see yourself, you can't help but start to experience yourself differently if you change the way that you think about other people and look at other people. So if you start thinking of them as being this perfect spirit and see them as being totally innocent, then you will start to experience yourself as being totally innocent. Then you start to experience yourself as being this perfect spirit. There's no way around that. It's like a law of the mind. It's like it doesn't matter what people think about it. It's just true. And the way to know that it's true is to try it and to practice it. And if you can really get some mental discipline going, which is part of what the workbook of A Course in Miracles is all about. It gives you the mental discipline that is required to think along certain lines. If you actually do it, then it literally has to work. It's like you couldn't mess it up if you tried. I know because I've tried. And A Course in Miracles would say that right-mindedness, which is forgiveness, leads to oneness automatically. And it says that from there the mind has nowhere else to go because its direction is always determined by the thought system to which it adheres. So it's all dependent on what kind of thoughts you're allowing to dominate your mind. Are you letting the Holy Spirit dominate your mind, or are you letting the ego dominate your mind? The ego being this idea of separation. And the ego likes the idea of separation, because the ego likes individual identity, likes that feeling of specialness that comes along with it. The Holy Spirit, on the other hand, encourages us to rejoin with the whole, to return to oneness, to return to that kind of a reality. And that kind of a reality really is a better form of life. It really is better to be spirit than to be a body. It really is better to be a butterfly than to be a caterpillar. It's a less restricted form of life. And the irony here is tremendous, because if you change what is in the projector, then the movie will also change. What is on the screen will also change. It's just that now you're focusing on something that can work instead of focusing on something that can't work, at least, not more than temporarily at best. So now you're dealing with the cause instead of the effect. Your experience will start to change. It's a better experience. It's a higher quality of life. It's not about giving up the world. People ask, oh, how can I live this kind of spirituality and still have my friends and my girlfriends and my sex life and my money and, and my goals and dreams and all this? It's simple. You just live a normal life. People ask me, how can I live this way? I say it's simple. Just be normal. Don't be weird. Be normal, live your life, do the same things you would have done anyway. The only difference here is that now you're looking at it differently. And I would contend that you can enjoy your life more by practicing this kind of spirituality, because you feel less guilty. As you forgive others, you are forgiven, and you start to get in touch with your own innocence. And what would that do for your ability to enjoy life? I enjoy life now more than ever. I was a musician my whole life. I enjoy listening to music now more than I ever did. I don't see any reason to give up my relationships. I still like the nice romantic walks on the beach and the sunsets and all that. And I'm not saying that anybody has to give that up. I'm just saying that what you do is you look at it differently. And in looking at it differently, you're actually kind of like undoing the ego and living your life at the same time. And I contend that life can be more enjoyable that way. Because when I go to a movie, there's a part of me that knows that it's not real. But that doesn't stop me from enjoying it. And that's what this life can be like. You don't have to stop enjoying it. You don't have to give up your relationships. You don't have to give up anything. If you think you have to give up something, that's making it just as real to your unconscious mind as if you want it. So you don't have to give up anything. All you have to do is look at it differently. And so you live a normal life. You're forgiving it at the same time. And by doing so, you're actually returning home to God. So you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have your life and you can forgive it at the same time and be going home to God and building something permanently. Like Jesus was talking about 2,000 years ago. He talked about building your house upon the rock instead of on the sand. Well, the sand is the shifting sands of time. The sands of this world, where all you can depend on is that it's going to change. But the rock is the reality of spirit, something that doesn't change, something that is constant. And by being constant, it's real. It's an idea that was expressed by Plato also, that if something is real, it doesn't change. Because if it changes, then it's evolving. And if it's evolving, then it's not perfect. And if it's not perfect, then it's not real. That's the criteria that A Course in Miracles uses. And so this kind of reality that we're returning to is something that really can be depended on. It really is a better way of life. And yet you can still have your normal life at the same time. I might add one comment about people's attitude that they think that spirituality is about giving up things. They think that spirituality is about giving up their relationships and their body and their bodily experiences and all the things that they have in this world. I got news for them. 30, 40 years from now, they're going to have to do that anyway. They're going to have to give up all the things in this world because the body isn't going to last. It's not going to last that long. And so why not use that 30 or 40 years to build something permanent, something that can be counted on, something that will last, even after the body appears to die. And since you get to live your normal life anyway, and since it's a better quality of life anyway, then it's a no-brainer. It is a better way of life, and it is a smart decision to live the way that Jesus did and forgive as you go, and it actually leads to a better experience. I saw Art in person 17 times over a period of 9 years, from the end of 1992 to the end of 2001, shortly after the World Trade Center tragedy. Then I didn't see him for 2 years. And I was at a crossroads 2 years later, 2003, because I didn't want to speak in public. And I actually refused to speak in public the first 6 months that the Disappearance was out. And they came back at the end of 2003, and I had finally spoken 3 or 4 times in public just to go on the record about certain things. I wanted to answer certain questions, make sure that people understood that this was my real experience, that this is, you know, something that really happened. I didn't make it up. There was nothing embellished about it. People have been investigating the book for 4 years. Nobody's ever found anything in it that isn't true. You know, it's a very consistent book that follows a very observable timeline all throughout the 1990s, including events. And it was like, you know, and there were personal events that you know, could be investigated and that people could see really happened. So it was like, you know, all of a sudden I didn't see them for 2 years. The book had been published, and my life was being turned upside down. And I decided I would speak a few times in public, and that would be it. I would quit. So I figured I was finished at the end of 2003. And that's when they appeared to me again. And I said, well, hey, I did my job, right? I mean, you know, I went on the record and did this, you know, all these questions, answered them, and, you know, I'm all done, right? And they said, well, no. You're going to start flying over 100,000 miles a year teaching spirituality. And I thought, well, then the ego kicks in. You know, I thought, well, hey, they must think I'm pretty good. They want me to go out and do that. And they said, no. They said the reason that you should go out and speak is because you're afraid of it. And if you're afraid of something, or if something is making you nervous or upset, or even taking away any of your peace of mind, that's a forgiveness lesson. So they counseled me and said, you know, you should go out there and do this, and you should forgive it as you're doing it. And that would be the perfect forgiveness lesson for you. So I took them up on it, and it took a good 1.5 years, almost 2 years after that of practice. But eventually, I got to the point where I could speak in public without being the slightest bit nervous. And there was such freedom in that, you know, to be able to go out and speak to people and not be afraid, that it was like being let out of prison. Because I felt, wow, I could do this. I could go out and speak to people and, you know, go around the world and do this, and, you know, what freedom in that, and what a great experience. And I get to meet all these wonderful, you know, people and see all these wonderful places. So I feel very lucky. And they appeared to me 11 times in the second series of visits. And then, at the end of the second series of visits, which was ended in August of 2005, I asked them if I would ever see them again. And they said, well, why don't you think about that for about 1 year and see if this is really the kind of life that you want to live. And that sounded a little ominous to me. And I was right. There were things that happened in the next year that made me question if I wanted to, you know, keep doing this. But then I would meet people, like there's a place in New York called Omega Institute. And I met this wonderful guy who's a Vietnam veteran. And he had had nightmares for like 30 years about Vietnam. And you wouldn't want to know some of the things that he saw there. But by reading The Disappearance of the Universe, he was able to forgive these things that he had seen in Vietnam. And he had had terrible nightmares for like 30 years, and he was able, you know, to stop those nightmares. And he was so honest with me, and now he's sharing the book with other Vietnam veterans. I realized, how can I not continue? How could I possibly not go on with this kind of work? So I made the decision that I wouldn't want to do a third book. And so, you know, at the end, you know, of, it was really 2006, you know, a year had gone by, and by the end of 2006, about, you know, a few months ago, around Christmas time, I knew Art in Person would be there for me if I wanted them to be there, and they were. And we started doing a third book. And the focus of the third book is going to be love, but not the love the way that the world usually thinks about it. It's an all-encompassing kind of an experience, which is an experience of spirit, which is what you really are. And the third book will be about living from that experience and having that experience, which is what all of this has been leading to. As the Course says, this is the experience that the Course is directed toward. The Course says a universal theology is impossible, but a universal experience is not only possible, but necessary. And it says it is this experience toward which the Course is directed. And that's the experience that the third book is coming from. And I'm very excited about it. And Art in Person are appearing to me once a month. which is the most they've ever appeared to me in the shortest amount of time. I think the book will be done by the end of the year, by the end of 2007, I hope. It should be published in 2008, and I'm very happy about it. And it will also answer the question, people ask me, who is Arden in this lifetime? Because people know from the books that 2,000 years ago, Thomas was Thomas. In this lifetime, Thomas is me. In the next lifetime, Persa is, that incarnation. We also know that 2,000 years ago, Thaddeus was Thaddeus, and that will be Arden in the next lifetime. But it was never revealed who Arden is in this lifetime. And that's something that I believe will be revealed in the third book. So I'm pretty happy about that personally, because it's also led to a wonderful relationship on my part, something that I didn't see coming, something that maybe I didn't think that I deserved, but it certainly is a wonderful experience, and I'm very grateful for everything that's happened, for everything that is happening and is going to happen, and for a guy who is just sitting there suffering, I've done pretty well, so I can't complain.